There is a specific hour that matters more than any other in the story of Niccolò Machiavelli. It is the evening hour. Not in a palace, not in a council chamber or a diplomat's court. In a small farmhouse 7 miles south of Florence, in the village of Sant'Andrea, in the year 1513. A man who had spent 14 years at the center of one of the world's most sophisticated political machines was spending his days arguing with woodcutters over stolen firewood, playing cards at the local inn, catching thrushes in the dark with a bundle of cages on his back. Machiavelli himself described this life in a letter to his friend Francesco Vettori in December of 1513, a letter that historians now consider one of the most revealing private documents of the entire Renaissance. He described the arguments over firewood, the humiliation of a man who had once sat across from popes and French kings, now in a rage because a neighbor was deducting 10 lire from payment for timber, money the neighbor claimed Machiavelli had owed him since losing at cards 4 years earlier. But then the evening came, and everything changed. He wrote this in his own words. "At the door, I take off the day's clothing, covered with mud and dust, and put on garments regal and courtly. And reclothed appropriately, I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them with affection, I feed on that food which only is mine and which I was born for. And for 4 hours of time, I do not feel boredom. I forget every trouble. I do not dread poverty. I am not frightened by death. Entirely, I give myself over to them." The ancient courts, based on what we know of his intellectual habits and his later work, were almost certainly the great historians of Rome. Livy above all, whose Republican histories would consume the next decade of his thinking, and likely Plutarch, Tacitus, the writers who had watched empires rise and collapse and recorded what they saw. The company of the dead. Speaking across centuries to a man who understood them better now than he had before, they took everything from him. Out of those 4 hours came The Prince, the most influential handbook on political power in Western history, studied by rulers, generals, presidents, and strategists for 500 years, written by a man with dislocated shoulders in a peasant's cottage on a farm he had retreated to after being tortured and exiled. A man who had seen power operate at its highest levels for nearly 2 decades and had just been destroyed by it. At the center of what he wrote is one principle so precise it deserves its own examination. You do not need them to love you. You do not even need them to like you. But you cannot, under any circumstances, allow them to hate you. Drop this in the comments right now. I understand the difference between respect through strength and destruction through contempt. This is Laws of the Prince, and this is the art of being feared without being hated. Before we can understand what Machiavelli wrote, we have to understand what Machiavelli lived. The Prince is not political theory. It is field notes, the compressed intelligence of a man who spent 14 years inside Renaissance Italy's most volatile political environment, and then watched everything he built get destroyed in a single season. He was born in Florence on May 3rd, 1469, the son of a lawyer who had fallen on hard times. The record of his life is essentially blank until 1498, when he was 29, the year Florence executed Savonarola and the Republican government took shape. Machiavelli was appointed head of the Second Chancery with no prior political experience. Over the next 14 years, he became one of the most active diplomatic minds in Renaissance Italy, sent to negotiate with King Louis XII of France, to the court of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, dispatched to the papal courts, and, crucially, accompanied Cesare Borgia for several months in the Romagna in late 1502 and early 1503, watching the Duke operate at close range. He also organized Florence's civic militia from scratch, convinced that a state dependent on mercenaries was a state with no real security. Then, in the summer of 1512, everything ended. A Spanish army, acting on behalf of the Pope, defeated Florence's militia at the city of Prato. The Republican government collapsed. The Medici family, who had ruled Florence for decades before their expulsion in 1494, returned to power in September 1512. Machiavelli was dismissed from his position by decree on November 7th of that year. He was 43 years old. What followed was worse. In early 1513, an anti-Medici conspiracy was uncovered. Machiavelli's name appeared on a list of potential sympathizers, not because of evidence, but because he was a known associate of the previous government. He was arrested, taken to the Bargello prison, and subjected to the strappado, his hands bound behind his back, hoisted by a rope from those wrists, and dropped repeatedly from a height. The force of each drop dislocated the shoulders. Scholarly sources, including the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, note he was held roughly 22 days and tortured during that imprisonment. There is no historical evidence he was involved in the conspiracy. He was released only because Giovanni de' Medici was elected Pope Leo X in March 1513, and a general amnesty was declared. Machiavelli walked out of the Bargello, injured, unemployed, politically suspect, and exiled to his family's small farm. He was forbidden from participating in political life. The city he had described as loving more than his own soul was tantalizingly close, 7 miles, and completely inaccessible. He sat down and wrote The Prince. This context matters enormously, because what Machiavelli produced was not the work of someone who had always stood outside power and analyzed it coldly. It was the work of someone who had served power faithfully, been destroyed by it unjustly, and now understood it at a level that required 14 years and a torture chamber to acquire. When he wrote about the relationship between fear and hatred, the weight of his own experience almost certainly shaped what he was willing to see clearly. He was not speculating from a library. He was reporting from a ruin. Almost everything that passes for Machiavellian wisdom in popular culture is a distortion. The famous line, "It is better to be feared than loved," is real. It appears in chapter 17 of The Prince. Almost no one quotes what surrounds it. Here is what he actually wrote, read in sequence. He begins by asking whether it is better for a ruler to be loved or feared. He answers that it would, of course, be best to be both. He acknowledges this is the ideal, and then he addresses the reality. Since the two rarely coexist, and a prince must choose, it is safer to be feared than loved. Then he gives his reasoning. Love, he argues, is held together by obligation, and since men are, in his famously bleak assessment, ungrateful, fickle, fraudulent, and cowardly, they will break obligations whenever it serves their advantage. Fear, by contrast, is held together by the dread of punishment, which never disappears. When a prince benefits people in good times, they swear loyalty. When danger arrives, they scatter. Love is a bond made of convenience. Fear is a bond made of consequence. But here is the part that is almost always omitted. Immediately after making this argument, Machiavelli adds, "A prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that, even if he does not win love, he avoids hatred, because he can endure very well being feared while he is not hated." This qualification changes everything. It transforms what looks like simple brutalism into something much more precise. Fear is a tool. Hatred is a catastrophe. The difference between the two is not the severity of the power exercised. It is the intelligence with which that power is directed. Machiavelli's prescription for how to avoid hatred was practical and focused on 2 areas. First, keep your hands off your subjects' property. He wrote something that remains remarkable 5 centuries later. Men will sooner forgive the death of a parent than the loss of an inheritance. Personal loss can be grieved. Material violation, the seizure of what you built, what you plan to pass on, creates a wound that does not heal. Second, stay off their households. People can tolerate harsh governance as long as it operates in the public realm. The moment power reaches into the home, it generates a different quality of resentment. It feels like invasion, and people fight invasions differently than they fight political opposition. In chapter 19, Machiavelli extended this to conspiracy. The best protection against insurrection is not a strong guard. It is the absence of popular hatred. A conspirator always calculates on finding support when they move. If the ruler is feared but not hated, the conspirator moves into a vacuum. No popular grievance means no cover, no celebration, no safety. Even the most motivated enemy will hesitate. Fear keeps people from testing you. The absence of hatred keeps them from celebrating when someone else tries to remove you. Together, they create a form of stability that neither love nor force alone can provide. And Machiavelli had not just read about this. He had watched it performed live, at close range, by one of the most studied figures in all of the prints. In October of 1502, Niccolò Machiavelli arrived at the court of Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois, in the Romagna region of central Italy. He had been sent by the Florentine Republic on a diplomatic mission. He stayed for nearly 4 months. And what he observed during those months shaped the central argument of the prince more than any other single experience in his life. Cesare Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI and one of the most feared military and political figures in Renaissance Italy. He had, within a few years, built a territorial state in central Italy through a combination of military force, strategic deception, and ruthless elimination of rivals. He was, by almost any measure, brutal. He was also, in Machiavelli's assessment, doing almost everything right. The Romagna, when Borgia inherited authority over it, was in chaos. Fragmented, lawless, civil order broken. Imposing order required force at a level that would generate serious resentment. Here is what Borgia did. He appointed a governor named Ramiro de Orco, a man described by Machiavelli as cruel and ready-handed, and gave him essentially unlimited authority to pacify the region by whatever means necessary. De Orco went to work. He was efficient, and he was brutal. Order was restored. But the population of the Romagna, understandably, came to despise him. And then Borgia had him publicly executed. One morning, the people of Cesena woke to find Ramiro de Orco's body in the main square, cut in 2, with a bloody knife placed beside the pieces. Machiavelli recorded the reaction of the population. They were at once satisfied and stupefied. Read that again. Satisfied and stupefied. Not simply relieved that a brutal governor was gone, but stupefied by the intelligence of the move. What Borgia had accomplished in a single calculated act was a complete redirection of accumulated hatred. The resentment that the Romagna had built up during the pacification, and it was substantial, it was real, was entirely attached to de Orco. Borgia had been seen, at least nominally, as the authority standing above de Orco's methods, and now Borgia had publicly punished those methods. He had, in the performance of a single morning, positioned himself as the guarantor of justice against the very cruelty he had authorized. Machiavelli was not naive about what had happened. He understood that Borgia had ordered the brutality, used it to achieve his goals, and then eliminated the instrument to avoid the consequences. He wrote about this case with the kind of detailed analysis that only comes from someone who observed it firsthand and spent years afterward thinking about what it revealed. What it revealed was a principle that Machiavelli considered essential to the art of governance. When harsh actions are necessary, they should be executed through an intermediary whenever possible. Not because the ruler lacks the will to act directly, but because the psychological cost of direct action accumulates in a way that intermediated action does not. The hatred generated by de Orco's methods attached to de Orco. Borgia absorbed only the credit for ending it. He also extracted a principle from this that went beyond the scapegoat strategy itself. If cruelty must be used, use it decisively, at the beginning, all at once, not spread out over time. Injuries inflicted quickly leave less room for resentment to accumulate. Benefits distributed slowly are felt and remembered longer. The sequencing is not incidental, it is the mechanism. Borgia eventually fell, not because his methods were flawed, but because the foundation collapsed. When Pope Alexander VI died suddenly, in 1503, the entire edifice of papal backing that had made his state building possible disappeared overnight. Machiavelli's analysis of this carries a tone that many readers have interpreted as close to genuine sympathy. Borgia had done everything a capable man could do. What destroyed him was not error, but fortune. What you can control is the quality of foundations you build, while fortune is with you. Running parallel to everything Machiavelli wrote about good governance of fear is his examination of what happens when a ruler crosses the line. When fear transmutes into hatred, when the population stops calculating the cost of resistance and starts calculating the cost of leaving things as they are. The phrase that best defines this failure came originally from a Roman tragic playwright named Lucius Accius, written in the 2nd century BC as dialogue for a stage villain named Atreus, never intended as advice, intended as a warning. In Latin, oderint dum metuant. Let them hate me, so long as they fear me. The Roman statesman Cicero quoted it in his work On Duties, written in the fall of 44 BC, months after Julius Caesar was stabbed 23 times during a Senate session at the theater of Pompey. Cicero used it as proof. The assassination was the demonstration, in his own lifetime, that no accumulation of power can withstand the hatred of many. The phrase was not description, it was epitaph. Machiavelli had read Cicero. He had studied Roman history as a mirror of his own present. And what that history demonstrated, with a clarity requiring no interpretation, was that oderint dum metuant was not a governing philosophy. It was a countdown. The Roman Emperor Caligula, who historians note was famous for having this phrase on his lips, illustrates the mechanism with brutal precision. He came to power in 37 AD, genuinely celebrated, son of the beloved general Germanicus, seen as a relief after the dark, reclusive reign of Tiberius. In his first months, he released political prisoners, abolished certain taxes, staged public games, distributed money to the army and population. Within months, everything changed. What emerged, and historians still debate whether the cause was early trauma, a serious illness in his first year of rule, or the intoxication of absolute power with no checks, was a ruler who appeared to have abandoned the distinction entirely. He reinstated the very treason trials he had abolished. He confiscated property on manufactured pretexts. He humiliated senators in public, in ways serving no political purpose beyond wounding their dignity. He became unpredictable, not in the calculated way that projects authority, but in the genuinely arbitrary way that tells people no behavior will protect them. That last point is the mechanism. Fear functions only when people believe their safety is connected to their behavior, that loyalty has a return. The moment that belief collapses, fear stops operating as control. It becomes the psychological state of an animal that understands it is trapped. And trapped animals do not calculate. They struggle. By 41 AD, Caligula had generated hatred in nearly every class of Roman society that held any power. The conspiracy that ended him included members of the Praetorian Guard, the soldiers whose entire function was to protect him. He was stabbed 30 times in January of that year. He was 28 years old and had reigned for less than 4 years. Machiavelli's point was never that cruelty is wrong in the abstract. His point was that cruelty detached from strategic intelligence is self-defeating. The prince who understands this builds a structure of fear that is calibrated, consistent, targeted, and, crucially, stops well short of the violations that generate the specific quality of hatred that makes people willing to accept any cost to remove you. There is a calculation at the heart of every functional power dynamic. Am I better off with this ruler in place or without them? As long as the answer is the former, as long as the population calculates that their situation, however imperfect, is preferable to the chaos of removing the ruler is structurally safe. The moment that calculation reverses, the structure fails, and what reverses it is not harshness. It is the specific violations of property, dignity, and personal security that Machiavelli identified as the sources of lasting hatred. Across the Prince and the Discourses on Livy, the longer work he began in the years following the Prince, drawing on his study of Rome's republican history, Machiavelli laid out the specific behaviors that allow a ruler to hold fear without generating hatred. These are not abstract principles. They are mechanics. They are observable patterns from the historical cases he studied and from the courts he had personally operated in. The first is consistency of consequence. A ruler can be severe, can punish hard, act without hesitation, and still hold the threshold, as long as the severity is predictable. What people can adapt to, they can tolerate. What they cannot adapt to is arbitrary power, punishment that arrives without connection to any identifiable behavior, rules that change without notice. Predictable severity creates discipline. Arbitrary severity creates the psychological state that precedes revolt. The second is the protection of common life. Machiavelli returned to this point repeatedly. Keep the exercise of power out of the domestic sphere. Leave people's households, their property, their family security alone. This is not generosity. It is strategy. The home is where people feel most personally invested. Violations there are not experienced as political challenges. They are experienced as personal attacks, and personal attacks generate a quality of hatred that political opposition does not. The third, and in many ways the most important, is the maintenance of the prince's reputation for virtue, even where the virtue itself is absent. Machiavelli wrote explicitly in Chapter 18 that a ruler must appear merciful, faithful, humane, upright, and religious. Not necessarily possess these qualities, but appear to possess them. Reputation is not decoration. It is protection. It absorbs the shock of unpopular decisions. It gives people a narrative positive enough to resist destabilizing. What connects these three is a single underlying principle. The people over whom you hold authority must always have a reason to believe they are safer with you than without you. The moment that reason disappears, the moment a critical mass of people decide they have nothing to lose by removing you, no amount of strength holds the position. Here is the thing about Machiavelli that is easy to miss if you only read what he wrote and never think about how he lived. He was, in the most personal sense, a victim of the very failure he described. He served Florence faithfully for 14 years. He was loyal, capable, effective. He organized its militia, conducted its diplomacy, served its governing body with what his own correspondence makes clear was genuine devotion. And when the regime changed, when the Medici returned and Florence's republican government collapsed, none of that mattered. He was stripped of his position, tortured, and exiled, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he was politically inconvenient. He was deeply, personally wounded by the injustice of what happened to him. He wrote to Francesco Vettori about missing Florence with an intensity that reads, even 500 years later, as genuine grief. And yet, what he produced from that wound was not bitterness or polemic. At least, that is the most reasonable reading of the text itself. He looked at his own destruction and asked structural questions. What should a ruler do to prevent this? How should power operate to create conditions durable enough to survive? The Prince is most convincingly read, not as a manual for cynicism, but as an attempt, by a man who had served a republic he loved, to describe the mechanics of stable governance in a world that offered no guarantees. He never got his position back. He died in June of 1527, 58 years old, of a stomach ailment. Just weeks before his death, the Medici had been expelled from Florence again, and for a brief moment it seemed possible he might be restored to the chancery he had served for 14 years. The new Republican government rejected him, this time because he had been too closely associated with the Medici in his final years. He was rejected by both sides, distrusted by the regime he had served for being connected to the regime that replaced it, distrusted by the regime that replaced that for having served the Medici. He died between them. The Prince was published 5 years after his death, in 1532, with the permission of Clement VII. Machiavelli never saw it in print. There is a story, almost certainly apocryphal, that on his deathbed Machiavelli described a dream in which he chose hell over heaven because the conversation was better. Rulers, historians, strategists of antiquity, rather than the pious poor. No contemporary source documents this, but it was circulating among Florentines within decades of his death, and whether or not it happened, it was invented by people who understood something true about him. A man who, even in exile and pain, changed into regal garments every evening to spend 4 hours in the company of the ancient dead. That part is documented. He wrote it down himself, and the book that emerged from those evenings is still being read 5 centuries later. That is who wrote The Prince. Not a monster, not a manipulator's guide. A devastated public servant with dislocated shoulders and 14 years of experience, trying to write down the thing that nobody in power had ever had the courage to say plainly. Every major environment where human authority operates contains this dynamic. You do not need a court, a throne, or an army. Fear in this context does not mean terror. It means there are real consequences to your commitments, and the people in your orbit understand this. Your word carries weight because your follow-through is consistent. People calculate before they test you. That is not cruelty. That is the minimum requirement of any authority that expects to hold. What tips it into hatred, even far removed from Renaissance courts, is the same set of behaviors Machiavelli identified. Arbitrariness, where consequences are disconnected from behavior. Violation of what people experience as private, their dignity, their security, their household sphere. Gratuitous exercises of dominance that serve no purpose beyond demonstrating that they can happen. These things do not produce useful fear. They produce the psychological state of someone who has nothing left to protect, and therefore nothing left to lose. And people with nothing to lose are the most dangerous people in any room, not because of their strength, they may have very little, but because they have stopped calculating. Machiavelli understood this with a precision that came from having lived on both sides of it. He had been the loyal servant whose contribution was assumed and then erased. He knew the quality of resentment that produces. And he wrote about it not as personal grievance, but as structural observation. This is what creates conspiracy. This is what makes even loyal people start calculating whether to remove you. The art of being feared without being hated is not about calibrating cruelty at the right volume. It is about ensuring that the people over whom you hold authority always have a reason to believe they are safer with you than without you, and never giving them cause to conclude otherwise. Machiavelli did not invent this principle. He observed it across 14 years of political experience, across centuries of Roman history, in the courts of princes and popes and kings. He simply had the intelligence to see it clearly, and the courage, sitting on his farm with dislocated shoulders and nothing left to lose, to write it down. If this analysis changed how you understand the relationship between authority and resentment, between power that endures and power that destroys itself, hit the like button. Every interaction tells the algorithm this content is worth finding. Subscribe to Laws of the Prince for deep examinations of power, psychology, and political strategy through the lens of history's most precise thinkers. And leave a comment below with this. Which of Machiavelli's 3 rules do you think is most frequently violated by people in authority today? Consistency, the protection of private life, or reputation? And which historical figure should we examine next on this channel? Because the conversation Machiavelli started in that farmhouse in 1513 is not finished. 500 years later, the same structures are operating. The same calculations are running. The same threshold between useful fear and corrosive hatred exists in every room where authority is exercised. The question is whether you know where it is.